The bright sun lit up the small shop's window as the shopkeeper, Margaret, lazily rearranged items on the shelves. The door creaked softly, and a young black girl in a bright yellow t-shirt walked in. Her face was serious, and her gaze focused. "How can I help you?" Margaret asked, looking up. The girl approached the counter and quietly said 4 words. Margaret froze, her expression changing instantly. In the next moment, she quickly ran to the door, turned the key, and locked the shop. What do you think happened next? Share your guesses in the comments and subscribe to the channel to find out the rest of this incredible story. The school bell rang, marking the end of another day. 7-year-old Mia grabbed her worn-out backpack and waved goodbye to her classmates. Her bright smile and lively energy belied the challenges she often faced. The laughter of her friends echoed behind her as she stepped out onto the sunlit sidewalk, the warm afternoon light casting long shadows on the ground. Mia's walk home was usually her favorite time of day. She loved taking in the sights of her neighborhood, the colorful storefronts, the chatter of shopkeepers, and the familiar hum of life. But today, something felt different. As she turned onto the narrow street that led to her house, a faint sense of unease crept over her. She couldn't quite place it, but it lingered in the back of her mind. Mia felt a chill creep up her spine as the man in the black hoodie moved in sync with her steps. At first, she told herself it was just a coincidence. The street was busy enough, with the occasional car rolling past and people chatting outside corner shops. But as she turned another corner and glanced over her shoulder, he was still there, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his hood pulled low over his face. Her heart began to race, though she tried to keep her pace steady. She didn't want to believe he was following her. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction, like so many others on this street. But why did he seem to be watching her? Why did his movements feel deliberate, calculated? Mia's small hand tightened around the straps of her backpack as she replayed her mother's warnings in her mind. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't wait to find out. Get somewhere safe. She decided to test her instincts. Nearing the next intersection, she turned sharply down a side street she didn't usually take. Her sneakers squeaked against the pavement as she moved quickly, her eyes darting to reflective shop windows to catch a glimpse behind her. At first, she saw nothing. A spark of hope flickered inside her, maybe she was wrong. But then, there he was. The man rounded the corner, his pace steady, his focus locked on her. He wasn't close enough to say anything, but the way he moved sent a jolt of fear through her. He wasn't just walking, he was following. Mia's breath came quicker now. Her chest felt tight as she fought the rising panic inside her. She thought about running, but where would she go? She was still a few blocks from home, and the idea of leading this man to her house terrified her. No, she needed to find someone, anyone, who could help. Mia's breathing was heavy as she pushed open the door to a small corner shop, the bell above jingling sharply. She stepped inside, her eyes darting toward the shopkeeper behind the counter. He was an older man with gray hair and a wrinkled face, engrossed in counting coins. The smell of stale bread and cleaning products filled the air, but Mia didn't have time to notice. Her heart was pounding, her voice trembling as she approached the counter. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her words rushed and shaky. "There's a man following me. He's been behind me for a while, and—" The shopkeeper glanced up briefly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of her. Her dark skin, her oversized backpack, her slightly disheveled appearance, everything about her seemed to trigger suspicion in his mind. He sighed, setting down the handful of coins he had been counting. "Following you," he repeated, his tone flat and dismissive. "Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" "No, I'm not imagining it," Mia insisted, her voice rising slightly. She pointed toward the door. He's out there, waiting. Please, can you help me? Call the police or... The shopkeeper raised a hand to silence her. Look, kid, he said, his voice laced with irritation. I've seen this before. You come in here, make up some story to distract me, and then suddenly something goes missing from my shelves. Not today. Mia's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. I'm not lying, she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. I'm not trying to steal anything. Please, you have to believe me. The shopkeeper crossed his arms, leaning back against the counter with a skeptical frown. If you're not buying anything, you need to leave. I don't have time for this nonsense. Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. Turning her head toward the window, she saw him. The man in the black hoodie was standing across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost as if he had all the time in the world. His face was shadowed, but his presence was unmistakable. He was waiting for her. Mia turned back to the shopkeeper, her voice cracking. He's right there. Can't you see him? The shopkeeper rolled his eyes and glanced lazily out the window. After a brief look, he shrugged. I don't see anything. And even if I did, it's not my problem. Now, get out of here before I call someone to deal with you. The words hit Mia like a slap. Her chest tightened, and her legs felt weak, but she knew she had to keep going. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her small hands trembling as she pushed it open. Mia stepped out of the shop, the jingle of the doorbell ringing hollow in her ears. She squinted in the bright sunlight, her heart pounding from the shopkeeper's indifference. She hoped, prayed, that the man in the hoodie would be gone. Maybe he had given up and walked away. Maybe she was just imagining things. But as her eyes scanned the street, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, standing across the road, leaning against a lamppost. His hood was pulled low over his face, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't pacing or distracted. He was waiting. Waiting for her. Her stomach twisted, and her legs felt weak, but she couldn't afford to freeze. The man straightened slightly as their eyes met, as if her reappearance was a signal. Mia quickly looked away, pretending not to notice him, and clutched the straps of her backpack tighter. Her small fingers trembled, but she forced her feet to move, walking briskly down the sidewalk. The sound of her sneakers against the pavement felt deafening, and she resisted the urge to look back again. She told herself she had to stay calm, not draw attention. But her mind raced with fear. Why was he following her? What did he want? Her steps quickened as she reached the corner. She made a sharp turn, her heart pounding louder with every second. She glanced over her shoulder, and her worst fears were confirmed. He was following her. His pace was steady, unhurried, but deliberate. He was keeping his distance, as if he wanted her to know he was there without catching up too quickly. Panic surged through her veins. This wasn't her imagination. This wasn't a coincidence. He was stalking her. Mia's small legs moved faster, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The once familiar streets of her neighborhood now felt alien and threatening. She scanned the shops and buildings around her, looking for a place to hide or someone who might help. Her mind raced, replaying her mother's warnings, asterisk if you ever feel unsafe, find an adult. Go somewhere public. Asterisk. Her eyes landed on another store up ahead, its door wide open and its windows gleaming in the sunlight. The faint hum of voices and movement inside gave her a glimmer of hope. Without hesitation, she darted toward it, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. As she reached the door, she cast one final glance behind her. The man was still there, his head casting a shadow over his face. He wasn't running, but his steady, relentless pace made her blood run cold. It was like a game to him, a game where he knew she had nowhere to go. Mia pushed open the door to the small shop, her tiny frame trembling as the cool air inside washed over her. The faint jingle of the bell above the entrance barely registered in her ears over the sound of her pounding heartbeat. She scanned the shop quickly, a cozy, cluttered space filled with shelves of canned goods, snacks, and household items. Behind the counter stood a fair-skinned woman with blonde hair tied into a loose bun. Her face looked tired, as though she had already endured a long day, even though the afternoon was still young. Margaret glanced up from the ledger she was updating, her blue eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the sight of the small girl standing at the entrance. Mia's yellow t-shirt clung to her, damp with sweat from her hurried walk, and her hands gripped the straps of her backpack so tightly that her knuckles were white. Margaret sighed inwardly. Kids wandering in without a parent usually meant trouble, but something about the look on Mia's face stopped her from dismissing the girl outright. "What do you need, sweetie?" Margaret asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. Mia hesitated, her feet frozen just inside the door. She wanted to say the words, but her throat felt tight, as if fear itself were gripping her vocal cords. She glanced toward the window, terrified that the man in the hoodie would appear any second. Margaret noticed the girl's nervous glances and frowned. "Are you okay?" she pressed, setting down her pen. Finally, Mia forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's following me." The words hung in the air, fragile but heavy. Margaret blinked, her brow furrowing. "Who's following you?" she asked, her tone shifting to one of mild concern. Mia took a few hesitant steps forward, her small frame trembling. "A man. He's outside. He's been following me for a long time." Her words came out in a rush, her eyes darting between Margaret and the window. Margaret's instinct was skepticism. Kids made up stories all the time, often for attention or to cover their own mischief. But something about the way this little girl spoke, her trembling voice, the tears brimming in her wide, frightened eyes, made Margaret pause. She leaned slightly over the counter, her expression softening. "Are you sure?" she asked gently, though the question felt hollow even as she said it. The fear radiating from Mia was almost tangible. Mia nodded vigorously, her hands clutching her backpack as if it were the only thing tethering her to safety. "He's out there," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw him. He was waiting." Margaret approached the window, her movements deliberate but cautious. She didn't want to alarm the girl further, but the tension in the air was undeniable. As she pulled the curtain aside and peered out onto the street, her heart sank. There he was, a man in a black hoodie, standing just a few steps away from the shop. At first glance, he appeared unremarkable, casually leaning against a lamppost. But something about his posture felt wrong. His shoulders were stiff, his head slightly tilted downward, as if he were trying to remain unnoticed while keeping an eye on the store. Margaret's eyes lingered on him, and the longer she looked, the more uneasy she felt. The way he stood, the deliberate way he avoided looking directly at the shop, sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced back at Mia, who stood clutching her backpack, her wide eyes fixed on Margaret with a mix of fear and hope. Margaret's earlier skepticism melted away. This wasn't just a frightened child spinning a story, this was real. Turning back to the window, Margaret's instincts kicked in. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the street for anyone else who might help, but the sidewalks were eerily empty. The man shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other, and for a moment, Margaret thought he might walk away. But then his hooded head turned ever so slightly toward the shop, and she realized he wasn't going anywhere. Without a word, Margaret moved quickly to the front door. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the lock, the loud click breaking the tense silence in the room. She flipped the sign to closed and drew the blinds over the window, shutting out the man's unsettling presence. Mia watched her every move, her small frame still trembling. "Is he still there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," she said softly but firmly. "But he's not getting in here." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Margaret's mind raced. Who is this man, and what did he want with a little girl? The possibilities ran through her head, each more unsettling than the last. She couldn't shake the image of his dark silhouette outside, waiting, watching. Margaret reached for the phone with trembling hands, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her. She glanced at Mia, who sat quietly on a stool behind the counter, her legs swinging nervously as she clutched her backpack. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the window again, where the shadowy figure of the man in the black hoodie lingered like a storm cloud. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the emergency number. The ringing on the other end seemed to stretch forever, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. Finally, a voice answered, calm and detached. "This is emergency services. What's your situation?" Margaret gripped the receiver tightly. "There's a man outside my store. He's been following a little girl for blocks, and now he's waiting just across the street. I need someone here immediately." The dispatcher's tone remained neutral, almost robotic. "Ma'am, can you confirm if the man has made any threats or attempted to harm the child?" Margaret's frustration bubbled to the surface. "No, not yet, but he's following her. She's terrified, and he's standing right there, watching us." "Are you really going to wait until something happens?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that made Margaret's stomach twist. "Ma'am," the dispatcher finally said, "it's not unusual for people to walk the same route. Are you certain this man poses a threat?" Margaret clenched her jaw, her voice sharpening. "I am certain. This isn't a coincidence. He followed her from another shop, waited outside, and now he's here. She's only 7 years old. Are you going to send someone or not?" The dispatcher hesitated again, and Margaret could feel her patience slipping. "I'm telling you, this man is dangerous," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "If you don't act now, you could be putting this girl's life in jeopardy." Finally, the dispatcher relented. "All right, ma'am. We'll dispatch an officer to your location. Please stay inside and lock the doors." Margaret exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and lingering frustration. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. She hung up and turned to Mia, who was watching her with wide, anxious eyes. "They're coming," Margaret assured her, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Mia nodded, though her grip on her backpack remained firm. Margaret gave her a small smile before standing up and pacing the shop. Her mind raced with questions. Why had the dispatcher been so dismissive? Was it because the man hadn't acted yet? Or was it because of Mia? The thought made her blood boil. It was bad enough that the world had failed this little girl once, she wouldn't let it happen again. The minutes stretched on, the tension in the shop thickening with each passing second. Margaret kept glancing out the window, her stomach twisting every time she saw the man still standing there, his hood pulled low over his face. He hadn't moved, hadn't made any attempt to leave. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. When the faint sound of sirens finally reached her ears, Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She turned to Mia, who had perked up at the noise. "See? They're here. Everything's going to be okay." A police car pulled up in front of the shop, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their faces a mix of professionalism and mild curiosity. Margaret hurried to unlock the door and stepped outside, pointing toward the man. "That's him," she said firmly. "He's been following her for blocks." "She's terrified." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. One of them approached the man, speaking in a calm but authoritative tone. The other remained with Margaret, asking her for details. As she recounted everything, the man's behavior, Mia's fear, the indifference of the first shopkeeper, Margaret felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The officer nodded, scribbling notes on a small pad. "We'll handle it," he assured her, but Margaret caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there, a hesitation that made her wonder if they truly understood the gravity of the situation. As the officers moved to question the man, Margaret stepped back inside and locked the door again. She watched through the window as the man raised his hands, his hood slipping back slightly to reveal his pale, tired face. Whatever explanation he gave, it wasn't enough to stop the officers from cuffing him and leading him to the squad car. Margaret turned to Mia, who was still sitting quietly on the stool, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. "It's over now," Margaret said softly, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. But even as the words left her mouth, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning. The officers escorted the man to the squad car, his hands cuffed behind his back. Margaret stood by the shop window, her eyes locked on the scene outside. She could feel Mia's small presence behind her, the girl clinging to her backpack with trembling hands. Margaret turned briefly to reassure her, but the heaviness in the air was undeniable. The man, now seated in the back of the police car, had finally removed his hood. His face, pale and lined with tension, was etched with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Fear? Regret? The officers questioned him quietly, their voices muffled through the glass. Margaret's gut told her there was more to this story than it seemed. One officer returned to the shop and knocked on the door. Margaret unlocked it cautiously, opening it just enough for him to step inside. His face was stern but not unkind as he gestured for her to sit down. "We've identified the man," he began, his voice steady. "He claims to be the girl's father." Margaret blinked, the words sinking in like stones dropping into a still pond. She turned to Mia, whose wide eyes mirrored her confusion. "Her father," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. "He says he left before she was born. Claims he's been trying to find the right moment to approach her. This is his first time seeing her in years." Margaret looked at Mia, whose face had gone pale. The little girl's lips quivered as she whispered, "My mom never talked about him. She said he was gone forever." The officer sighed, kneeling down to Mia's level. "I know this is confusing, but he's not being aggressive or threatening. He says he just wanted to see you, to make sure you were okay." Mia's small fists tightened around the straps of her backpack. "Then why didn't he just talk to me? Why did he follow me?" Her voice cracked with a mix of anger and fear. "He scared me." Margaret felt her heart ache at the sight of Mia's turmoil. She looked at the officer, her voice firm. Whatever his reasons, he terrified her. He had no right to follow her like that. The officer nodded. "We've told him that his actions were inappropriate. He'll be taken to the station for further questioning, but he doesn't seem dangerous. Just desperate." Margaret's gaze shifted back to the man in the car. Desperate. The word lingered in her mind as she tried to reconcile it with the fear she had seen in Mia's eyes. Who was this man? And what kind of father would choose to reappear in his daughter's life this way? Later, As the officers prepared to drive the man to the station, Margaret stepped outside with Mia. The little girl hesitated, standing half-hidden behind Margaret's leg. The man, now seated in the back of the police car, looked up and caught Mia's gaze. His eyes softened, and he mouthed something that Margaret couldn't make out. Mia, however, understood. Her shoulders stiffened as she turned to Margaret and whispered, he said, "I'm sorry." Margaret placed a comforting hand on Mia's shoulder, unsure of how to respond. The man's regret was evident, but was it enough? Could it erase the years of absence, the fear he had caused, or the uncertainty he had left in his wake? As the police car pulled away, Margaret led Mia back into the shop. The girl was quiet, her mind clearly racing. Margaret knelt down beside her and said softly, "Whatever happens next, you're not alone. We'll figure this out together." Mia nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the door. For the first time, the man who had followed her wasn't just a stranger. He was a father she had never known, and his sudden appearance left more questions than answers. Mia sat quietly in the small room at the police station, her legs dangling from the chair that was just a little too high for her. Across from her, the man, the one she now knew was her father, sat with his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. His posture was rigid, his face pale, but his eyes were filled with something Mia couldn't quite place. It wasn't just guilt, it was longing, a deep yearning that made her chest feel heavy. Margaret sat beside her, a steady presence. She had refused to leave Mia alone for this conversation, ensuring the little girl felt safe. The officer in the room nodded at the man to begin, and he took a deep, shaky breath before speaking. I know I've scared you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I need you to understand why." Mia didn't respond, her wide eyes fixed on him, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack like a lifeline. "I was young when your mother told me she was pregnant," he continued. "I thought I was ready, I wanted to be ready, but I wasn't. I panicked. I left, and I know now that it was the worst decision of my life." His voice cracked, and he paused to collect himself. Margaret glanced at Mia, who still said nothing, her expression unreadable. "I tried to come back," he said after a moment, his words tumbling out faster now. "But when I finally worked up the courage, your mother was gone. I didn't know where she had moved, and no one would tell me. For years, I searched. I didn't know how else to find you." He looked directly at Mia, his eyes glistening. "When I saw you on the street today, I knew it was you. You looked just like her, your mother. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to scare you, but I couldn't let you disappear again." Mia shifted in her chair, her fingers loosening their grip on her backpack. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" she asked, her voice small but firm. "Why did you follow me instead of just saying something?" Her father flinched at her question, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "I was afraid you'd hate me, that you wouldn't even want to talk to me. I thought, maybe if I waited, if I saw you again, I could figure out what to say." Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Margaret gently placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, silently encouraging her. "You scared me," Mia said finally, her voice trembling. "I thought you wanted to hurt me." Her father's face crumpled, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I would never hurt you, Mia. Never. I know I've hurt you in other ways, by not being there, by making you feel like you were alone, but I want to fix that. I want to be in your life, if you'll let me." Mia looked down at her lap, her thoughts swirling. She had imagined her father countless times, what he might look like, what he might say if they ever met. This wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but a small part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that he meant what he said. Margaret leaned closer to her, speaking softly. You don't have to decide everything right now. But sometimes, giving someone a chance can lead to something good. Mia looked up at her father again. His eyes were full of hope and regret, and for the first time, she saw how much he wanted this chance. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but something in her heart told her to give him a chance. Okay, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. But you have to promise, no more disappearing. No more scaring me. Her father nodded quickly, tears slipping down his cheeks. I promise, Mia. I'll never leave you again. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Mia nodded, her grip on her backpack finally loosening. It wasn't a perfect resolution, it would take time to rebuild trust and to understand one another, but it was a start. A new chapter in a story that had been waiting to unfold. Margaret smiled gently, her heart swelling with pride at Mia's courage. For the first time, the room felt lighter, as if hope had quietly slipped in and made itself at home. The story of Margaret and Mia spread far beyond the small shop where it all began. Local news outlets picked it up, sharing the tale of a shopkeeper who went above and beyond to protect a frightened 7-year-old girl. But as the story unfolded, it wasn't just Margaret's actions that drew attention, it was the deeper message beneath them. People were struck by the indifference Mia had faced before finding help. The first shopkeeper, who had dismissed her fears because of the color of her skin, became a symbol of the silent biases that permeate society. The image of a small, terrified girl being brushed aside stayed with those who read or heard about the incident, sparking conversations in schools, workplaces, and homes. Margaret, initially hesitant to speak publicly, eventually agreed to share her perspective. I didn't do anything extraordinary, she told reporters. I just listened. I believed her when no one else would. And that's what every child deserves, someone to listen, someone to protect them. Her words resonated deeply. Parents began questioning whether they were teaching their children to see people beyond stereotypes. Teachers discussed how to create safer, more inclusive environments in their classrooms. Even law enforcement agencies took note, examining their own biases and how they could better respond to vulnerable individuals. But the story didn't stop there. Mia's father, whose initial actions had caused so much fear, also became a figure of discussion. His regret and attempt to reconnect with his daughter opened a dialogue about second chances and the importance of confronting one's past mistakes. While many criticized his approach, others saw his eventual honesty as a step toward redemption. Mia's voice became central to the narrative. When asked what she had learned, her response was simple but profound: it's scary to speak up when you think no one will believe you. But sometimes, someone does. And that can change everything. The community rallied around Mia and Margaret, celebrating their courage and kindness. Fundraisers were held to support families in need, especially those struggling with single parenthood or systemic discrimination. Margaret's shop became a hub for local initiatives, a place where people could find resources, support, and a reminder that compassion still existed in the world. For Margaret, the incident was a turning point. She began volunteering at a local shelter, offering her time to children who needed a safe space. She often thought about Mia and the strength it took for her to walk into that shop and ask for help. It reminded her that small actions, locking a door, making a phone call, offering reassurance, could have an immeasurable impact. As for Mia, her life began to take on a new sense of stability. With her father now part of her life and Margaret as a steadfast ally, she started to feel safer, more confident. The once shy girl who had clutched her backpack in fear now stood taller, her stories serving as a beacon of hope for others. The incident also forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Conversations about racial prejudice, systemic indifference, and the importance of allyship became more common. People began asking harder questions. Why had it taken so long for Mia to find help? How many other children were dismissed or ignored because of assumptions and bias? The answers weren't easy, but they were necessary. The story of Margaret and Mia became a lesson for society, a reminder that every person deserves to be heard, protected, and treated with dignity. It showed that standing up for what's right, even in the smallest ways, can ripple outward, creating change far beyond what one might imagine. As the story continued to inspire others, Margaret often thought about that pivotal day in her shop. She couldn't help but feel grateful, not just for the chance to help Mia, but for the way the experience had opened her own eyes. It had shown her the power of empathy, the importance of listening, and the courage it takes to stand against prejudice. If you found this story as moving as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that challenge and inspire. And let us know in the comments, how would you react in a moment like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts.